Chapter 4. In the afternoon of the next day, Olav stood on the green outside the place of pilgrimage. He was looking for his companions. In the yellow rays of the declining sun, the dust hung like a mist over the trampled grass. The place swarmed with folk who were now taking their departure. An immense cross came swaying along, carried in the midst of a body of men in penitential garments. They sang the litany as they marched, stirring up fresh clouds of dust with their feet. For a long time the notes of their singing floated after them like a streak through the drone of voices and the thunder of hoofs, the plaintive whining of fiddles and the sombre throbbing of harps. The beechwood surrounded the place like a wall, and the foliage shone with a dull gleam in the sunshine against the blue-grey sky. It was a hot day. At the bottom of the slope a fair was being held in a meadow by the stream. The smoke of bonfires rose above the copsewood. Oxen and sheep were being roasted whole down there, and the shrill cries of the vendors cleft the hum and uproar of folk who were now beginning to be drunken and frolicsome. A few people were still moving in and out of the church, but that morning the men from the Reindeer had barely been able to press their way in to the Mass, and they had seen nothing, so packed was the great church, and it had taken a long time to elbow their way into the chapel where stood Our Lady of the Oak. At least 100 candles were burning in there, like a wall of living flame. The shrine gleamed with gold and silver. The image was black as pitch. The face was long, stiff, and hard under the golden crown, and the child peeping out under the mantle of gold brocade was like the stump of a root. But it was very ancient and venerable. There was no time to say any long prayer within the sanctuary, such was the press of folk. Afterwards, when they were to share their provisions, they had bought cider. It was mighty good, and their heads were a little amazed with it. Then they lost each other in the crowd down in the fair field. Olav and Thomas had kept together longest, but then Thomas would stand listening to a minstrel so long that at last Olav was tired of waiting and went on. Now he stood at the edge of the forest, looking out if he could see any of his companions in the swarm that drifted hither and thither on the green. He felt within his kirtle for the packages which he was carrying over his belt. They were gifts that he would send home, a last greeting. Embroidered velvet gloves for Signy and Una, a rosary of corals and gold beads for Cecilia, a dagger for Eirik. Though Eirik would now inherit all his arms, except Kinfetch, he must remember to send a message home that the axe was to descend in Cecilia's branch of the family. The thought was like stirring up a wasp's nest. He turned away from it, looked about him. No, he could see none of his company. From somewhere in the wood behind him he heard singing. It sounded like ballads. Olav turned and followed the woodland path. If they were dancing, he would be certain to find Galfred in any case, and Leif. After a while he came to a great open space in the forest. Upon this plain stood a band of dancers, getting their breath. People lay on the grass under the trees, eating and drinking. A little child ran towards Olav, stumbled and fell. Olav picked up the little boy who was howling and tried to comfort him. He stood looking about him with the child on his arm, when a stout, good-looking young woman came running up. Olav smiled faintly and shook his head at her flood of words. With a sudden gesture he pressed the boy to him and kissed him before handing him to the mother. It was like taking farewell of something. The dancers formed a ring again. They were only men who went arm in arm and broke into a wild and stirring tune. Olav went forward, forcing his way through the crowd looking on. The strange, resounding and provocative dance inflamed him through and through. It was fighting they sang of, and it seemed like something he had heard before. His heart stirred as the grave mould stirs over a dead man who wakes and struggles to come out, and when he saw the look on the faces of those around him, his excitement grew. Old men stood leaning forward, beating time with their heads, glowing with passion. Big, portly matrons listened with hard faces, as though the song had to do with disasters they themselves had suffered. Even Olaf felt that he knew something of it, but could not come at what it was. And all at once he had it. The river, Glana, rushed down in flood, cold in the shadows, while the sun still blazed on the pinnacles of the keep. The castle stood on a little island, cleaving the stream. And he stood in the water meadow watching the Earl's retainers, the lads from the Cinque Ports, as they danced and sang of the battle between English and Scots. That was the song! By God! Memories that he had never recalled for years rushed up from the depths within him, like prisoners from a dungeon. A stream of rapid visions, furious hand-to-hand fighting, torchlight flickering over wild swordplay in a narrow gateway that sloped away into darkness. And then he was in a boat, rowing in the pale evening light outside the island walls of Stockholm. And facing him in the stern sat the Earl, short and broad as the door of a loft, invincibly strong and shaggy and warm as a he-bear, bright in his crimson velvet cloak, with his clear amber eyes laughing at war and adventure. "Oh, Lord Alf! Lord Alf, my liege!" The chain of dancers surged past him, and there was no end to the wild, ringing song. The men hung together, hooked arm in arm, leaning backward with their shoulders, and the chain swayed. The fiery faces of the singers could be seen through the clouds of dust, each time they leapt high and stamped hard as they came down. Then a sudden jerk to the right, all round the ring, and back they came, charging toward the left. His memories still sped through Olaf's mind, of men with whom he had been friends in a cool and pleasant fashion, each man for himself within the iron shell of his coat of mail, but covering each other with shield and sword. Oh, to hell with all women! They cling all too closely to a man. The glare of flames among the dark timber gables of a city street, and himself, a lad of 20, fully armed, standing in a doorway. A young serving-maid, whose name he had forgotten, seeking to drag him in and hide him. He laughed, snatched a kiss, and tore himself away, rushed up the street sword in hand to where he heard the trumpets of the Danish king's men, and he was wild with an angry fear lest the Earl's men should let themselves be driven down to their ships without attempting resistance. Olaf's hands clenched upon the borders of his cloak. His spirit was in a violent uproar. To think that he could forget all this! And now it came back, his vision of the manor on the hill above the creek, but strangely paled and faded now. It was fraught with memories of ill health and contention with a dense grey, overmastering force, and of a sick woman who crushed the youth and manhood out of him, and who grew ever paler and more faded in spite of sucking his strength dry. And with the sudden break, whatever feelings these memories had brought him hitherto, they now sickened and revolted him. Jesus! Had he not been as one bewitched, or thrust into hell? The song ended in a resounding roar and the thud of 100 feet that struck the ground at once. Olaf drew a deep breath. The ring of dancers broke up, and the crowd of lookers-on scattered. Olaf moved about, uncertain what to do with himself. Then he ran against someone, looked at him, and saw that it was the blind man from the church of the preaching friars. For a moment they stood and stared at each other. So it seemed to Olaf. The wan, sightless face, contracted with misfortune or bitterness, seemed all a gaze. Olaf's only thought was that he had been clumsy. Then a change came over the stranger's face, as though awakening from an evil dream. A smile broke out on it, as he felt before him with his hands and spoke a few words. "Cognovis me?" whispered Olaf doubtfully. The stranger, he was not much more than a lad, Olaf now saw, replied at once in the same language, but he spoke it so quickly and fluently that Olaf did not understand a word. Non capio bene Latinum, muttered Olaf awkwardly. The other smiled courteously and began again, more slowly, in fewer words. Olaf grasped so much that he was parted from his company, and now he asked Olaf to lead him somewhere, to the church. With hesitation, Olaf accepted the young man's proffered hand, and felt with aversion how clammy it was. Then he let the other take his arm and led him toward the path by which he had come. The young man tried to enter into conversation in Latin, English, and French, a little of each. Olaf understood him to say that he knew him from the Dominicans' church. Nonnes, he sought the word for blind. He stole a look at the other's ruined eyes. No, he must be stone blind. A shock went through him. Then someone had pointed him out to the man. Nonnes Cassis? The tension filled him with something like joy. Now he must be on guard. It was dark in the forest. Cautiously Olaf led the blind man over roots and stones in the path, watching intently for any sign of men lurking in the undergrowth. And it had chanced unluckily that he had the stranger's left arm locked in his right. Or had the other managed it of set purpose? Olaf was ashamed to change now, but he kept an eye on the man's sword hand. He was waiting all the time for the flash of a dagger, or for someone to burst out of the thicket, and the way could not have been so long as he went to the sports green, nor the path so narrow, and it was dark here in the wood. But to the blind man's questions he replied calmly that his name was Olaf. He was a Norwegian and a merchant. He would have told him, too, where he lay with his ship. It were well that the man should know he had no thought of hiding, but when he tried to explain it he could not make himself clear in the foreign tongue. And all at once they were out of the wood. Olaf led the blind man up toward the church, which now gleamed faintly in the fading light. And a dull, oppressive fear came over Olaf. It was not with dagger or armed men that the stranger would attack him, but into the church with this man he would not go. Then a serving man came running down toward them and called out on seeing his master. The latter at once dropped Olaf's arm, took him by the hand, and thanked him for his help. Olaf was dumb with surprise. The young knight turned to his man, laid a hand on his shoulder, and allowed himself to be led away, as he turned once more and greeted Olaf with a parting valet. Olaf stood still. It was now so incomprehensible that he felt almost disappointed. He followed the stranger with his eyes. Before the gate of the little priory by the church, a company was getting into the saddle, and in a little while they came riding past him. There were several men of rank in velvet, with gold chains on their breasts. They had excellent horses and costly gear. The blind man rode upon a black stallion, which was led by a page. The serving men who followed behind were armed and equipped for a journey, and in the rear came several horses laden with merchandise. Olaf guessed they had come from far away. And now it dawned on him that the blind man must have been away from home some days. So she, the wife, had sent for him while she was alone. He recalled the arbour in the secret corner of the garden, the young woman who came with perfumed hair, naked under her thin silken robe. Neither pixie nor phantom, as he made himself believe, only an unfaithful wife. In a surge of passion Olaf felt as if he himself were the man betrayed. His rage was red and hot as lust. He could have seized and killed her with his bare hands. And he was dazed a while by a strange, unreal feeling. This had happened to him once before. Then the rush of blood ebbed back, the red mist faded from his eyes. He felt the ground under his feet once more, and saw everything about him with a strange distinctness. The beaches were bathed in a pale, subdued light, and the sky above was whitish with a few bright shreds of cloud. The grey stones of the church flushed faintly in the afterglow. The place was now almost deserted, and a scent of dew and dust arose from the trampled grass. And Olaf saw the cold, clear truth of it, that this game in which he had here been involved, he had taken part in it once before. But this time he was himself the thief. He took the front of his cloak in both hands, as though he would tear off his bonds. But from the innermost chambers of his soul, now that at last he had been forced to open a crack of the door, the darkness spoke to him, a voice without words. This was the meaning of what had lately befallen him. Another man's wife had been offered to him, so that he had but to reach out his hand to take her. And he himself had had no other thought, until that cry had warned him, from heaven or from purgatory. Had he not been snatched away, as a child is snatched from the fire by its mother, he himself would now have been a wedded woman's paramour. Olaf began to walk swiftly, as though he would escape from these thoughts. He strode across the fair field. Embers still glowed upon the ground in the increasing dusk. In one place a fire was burning brightly. Many people still lingered here, and all seemed drunken. Olaf walked on rapidly. He entered another wood by a well-marked path which led downhill. In a kind of desperate resentment he struggled to drown the voice. "In the devil's name, I did not touch the woman. I have behaved like a fool, making eyes at an English bitch, because I thought she was like my wife." And he might well be angry, at his age, for being caught in the woman's snares. But I had no such thought in my mind, and did I not make off at once when I saw what she had in mind? And that the blind man had known him could hardly be a miracle, for he had often seen that blind men, beggars and aged folk, seemed to see with their whole body. They had the scent and hearing of dogs. But all his striving to drown the voice within him was of no avail. He had violated no man's honour, indeed, but he had not regarded it in this way as he led the blind man through the wood. Then he had been sure that the other sought his life, and justly. And again he knew that he had been guilty in accompanying the strange lady's messenger, or an old drowned guilt had floated up into the daylight. As he hastened down the wooded path in the growing darkness, over stock and stone and bog-hole, sure of foot as a sleepwalker, it was borne in upon him that this darkness into which he hurried farther and farther was his own inner self, and presently he would have entered its deepest and darkest secret chamber. Soon he would be driven in, with his back against the last wall. But he knew withal that he would fight and defend himself to the utmost. And he understood. First God had spoken to him face to face. That was in the night when he was to lose Ingunn. In that hour when he was forsaken by his only friend, God had spoken to him from the forsakenness of the cross. In that night when his grief was such that he could have sweated blood, God had appeared to him, bedewed with the blood of the death agony and the scourging and the nails and the thorns, and he had spoken to him as friend to friend. O all ye that pass by, behold, and see if there be any sorrow like unto my sorrow. And he had seen his own sin and sorrow as a bleeding gash upon those shoulders. Yet he had not been strong enough to come. And God had spoken to him a second time. He had spoken to him in his holy church, as soon as Olaf was so far healed of grief's fever that he could compose himself and listen to calm words. Yet he had voluntarily delayed upon the road, nor was he any longer sure that he had obeyed the call, unless... But now this last thing had befallen him, so that he was forced to see what manner of man he was, and what was his sin. All at once he stood, as it were, outside, and looked upon himself, as one stands behind a fence and looks at a man labouring in a barren, weed-grown field. The man toils about a bramble bush, trying to clear it away, and tears his flesh and his clothes upon it. But the weeds, the coarse and noxious growth of tares and thistles, he seems not to see. Yet it is not the bramble that has choked all the good seed in his cornfield. It may bulk largely as it stands in full bloom, but it does not seed and scatter everywhere. One may clear it out once for all if one will take the trouble. And there it stands flowering, rank in its unprofitable beauty, and no one will despise it. He had only been willing to acknowledge his great sins. For indeed they were blood-red transgressions against the laws that prevail in the kingdom of heaven. That he had always known. But at the same time he had known that among men it was accounted otherwise. And according to the law that held good among the men with whom his birth entitled him to rank himself, he had done no more than his duty, vindicated his right and his wife's honour. Even if it came out, this thing that he had done in secret, the murder, the dastard's deed, it was not so sure that his memory would be tarnished with dishonour, even if his head had paid the penalty on the block. Not one man of all those he reckoned as his equals would judge him to be a dastard, if they knew everything. Olaf saw now that this knowledge had lain somewhere far back in his soul, always. Young as he had been, he could not escape doing wrong, since his fate was tangled in the coil of other men's wrongs and misfortunes. But all the evil that followed was due to the attempted betrayal of him and Ingunn by those who should have defended the two children's rights. Up to the last and worst evil, his false confessions, the sacrilege which burnt his mouth and heart, foot by foot he had been driven to all this, since he had had to take his own and his foster sister's cause into his own hands, and as a raw youth he had grasped it mistakenly. He had never before thought it out clearly in this way, but within himself he had always known, in the midst of his distress, that God, the all-seeing, saw this much more clearly than he did, that his greatest sins were the sins of others no less than of himself, and inextricably bound up with the burden of his own misdeeds, he bore the burden of others. So he had bowed low and smitten his breast when the deacon said the Confiteor in the Mass. He was willing to confess, "Not one of these men standing about me is guilty of such black deeds as I." In the mirror of God's justice he saw himself sunken so much deeper than these others, as the reflection of the oak in a pond sinks deeper than that of the undergrowth around it. And even in a human view he must have seen himself standing as an oak above the brushwood. But in this unearthly light which now shone into his darkness, what he had secretly wished to preserve from God's hand appeared to him at last. The pride of the sinner, which is even harder to break than the self-righteousness of the righteous. Be that as it may, I am innocent of the sins of a mean man. Twice had Jesus Christ spoken to him out of the sweetness of his mercy, and he had shrunk away like a timid hound. Twice had the voice spoken, "Behold who I am! Behold the depth of my love." Now it said to him, "See then who thou art. See that thou art no greater sinner than other men. See that thou art as small a sinner." The sword sank into the most hidden roots of his being and pierced him. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. Whoever finds his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. Olaf saw that these words were truth, such as he had never dreamt of before. and when he understood their meaning it was like sinking beneath the ice-cold waters of the very ocean. He laughed with pain as he ran through the dark forest. He had behaved as though he were afraid of losing his life, he who had long been so tired of life that if it had not been for Ingunn's sake he could never have borne it for a day. He would not go back to it. He lost nothing if he now chose obedience, poverty, chastity, nay, the lot of a slave and a martyr's death at last. For all that he must renounce, he counted nothing worth. But what lay before him promised gains beyond measure, adventures and travels in distant lands, and at the last, peace and God's forgiveness, and admission to the ranks of his soldiers again. But now he tardily understood that then he must choose, not between God and this or that upon earth, not even his worldly life, but between God and himself. The path brought him to an open glade. It led high up along a slope where the trees had been cut. Above him he now saw a wide stretch of the sky, dark and strewed with stars. Below him lay a little valley. He could see that he was looking down over the tops of trees. The sound of running water came from somewhere in the darkness. Unconsciously he slackened his pace. The light, cooling breeze fanned his cheek. Olaf wiped the sweat from his forehead, and feeling that he was walking on high ground with open, airy space about him on every side, he had a sudden instinct that he was being led out into the wilderness. He walked here all alone in a foreign land, and didn't know where he was going. Here was no familiar place or thing which might help him to escape seeing what he would not see. Folk's speech, which he did not understand, could not break in and drown the voice that he would shun. Olaf halted abruptly. He seemed to absorb strength from the gloom around him and from the raw, cold earth under his feet, so that he felt his ego swell and grow in black defiance. "Why dost thou deal thus with me? Other men have done worse and more contemptible deeds. But thou hast not driven them from home and peace, and persecute them, as thou drivest and persecutest me." The voice which replied seemed to dwell in the very stillness under the wide, star-strewed heaven, and the forest that rustled faintly in the night breeze, and the hushed murmur of the brook in the valley. "Because thou dost yet love me, I seek after thee. Because thou dost long for me, I persecute thee. I drive thee out, because thou dost call upon me, even as thou fliest from me." The path descended steeply, leading into the thick of the woods. Olaf stopped again, threw himself down at the entrance of the dark gap that penetrated the foliage, and sat with his head buried in his arms. Visions came swarming upon him, without his being able to hinder them. Once he complained aloud. Was it to see this that he had been brought back to the very starting point, his youth? In secret he had been proud of his youth. After all, I was overborne by force. I was compelled to stand alone. No one helped me. Whatever I have done, or left undone, was not the sin of an ignoble man. Was there no one who helped him? Now he descried a little light low down. A lantern stood on the floor in a dark stable, and there were 2 young men. He recognized the face of Steinfinnsons, stricken and perplexed. It was he himself who had wounded his friend with a lie. Ah, that sin was his own, and no one else's. Now he saw that this was surely the first sin he had committed deliberately and wilfully, when he cast his guilt upon the shoulders of his friend, who, he knew, never refused to take up another's burden. "No!" He whispered it breathlessly. This he would not have. Let it be good for monk and priest, but he would not be imprisoned in this cell of self-knowledge they talked of, Let it be their concern alone to watch the mirror that reflects God's light and man's darkness. But he could not protect himself. The light that shines in darkness continued to burn, and in it he saw the 1,000 things that he had wilfully forgotten. Had no one helped him? They had helped him, those of whom he had asked help, Arnvid and the good bishop, Lord Thorfinn. They were the men he had loved and looked up to as his superiors. Of his inferiors he had never asked anything. But of the friendship of these two he had availed himself as fully and eagerly as any of his inferiors had availed themselves of him. The difference was that he had never thought of calling any man his friend and equal who came to him as a suppliant. Out of a pity that was both proud and lukewarm, he had given his gifts. But the men who took him under their protection when he came to them in his need had received him as a younger brother. Humiliation overwhelmed Olav like a landslide. He was painfully crushed beneath the rocks. No, God, I will not have this. Ingunn, help me, he prayed in his distress. You must bear witness for me. Ingunn, I was never false to you. Again he felt with overpowering clearness how near she was now. Death only hid her form, like a darkness. But he heard her answer close beside him, out of a sorrow so deep that it made the living seem like children who lacked understanding. I witness for you, Olav, and every soul to whom you have shown pity witnesses for you of your good deeds. They are many, Olav. You were designed to render abundantly to God. But your deeds have become as withered stalks of corn, tainted in root and ear. They have so long been choked by the tares. He saw them before him, sick and wan, ears that bore no corn to ripeness. His inmost will had driven them on, that will which God had given him for ruling and protecting. But this will had been overpowered by whims and desires and perversity and unwise impulses, as vassal kings overpower their rightful sovereign lord. He had been sustained by the secret pride that his sins in any case were not those of cowardice and ignominy. And now he saw that these great sins were a load that he had allowed others to put upon him, because he had never been strong enough to admit it when he had taken a false step through weakness and cowardice and thoughtlessness. By tricks and by honest dealing, by a little lying and a little truth combined, he had gained advantage for himself from the few men he had met in the world whom he had reckoned good enough to call his friends, to love and respect. He had never dared to tell them the truth about his own conduct, because he wished to have their respect, and because he needed their help. He stood in debt to his friends, he who had always looked down with pity on every debt-burdened wretch. It was not true, that which he had said to Bishop Thorfinn and to all his friends so often that he himself had almost forgotten what was the truth. It was a lie that he had asserted his right to his betrothed, merely because miscreants sought to take away their rights. Oh no, he had not been a strong-willed, resourceful grown man who took Ingunn and made her his, reckoning that if there is a dispute about a thing, he is best placed who has that thing in his possession. The truth was otherwise, humiliating, and at the same moment he was bathed in the sweetness of all these memories of his youthful love, now that at last they leapt up, naked, from beneath all the lies under which he had tried to hide them. He had been but a boy in those days at Fretterstein, and he had had no thought either of right or wrong, when he took to himself his young bride, dazed and wild with desire to possess her full sweetness and charm. He had thought no more than a child that reaches for everything it wants, without heeding, as it runs forward, whether it may fall. Behind his closed eyelids he saw a cleft in a scree. Under the rocks at the bottom of it ran a beck. Red rosebay waved on the face of the precipice. Before him walked Ingunn. He saw her long, supple back in the red kirtle. She was plaiting her thick, dark yellow hair, and he thought her so fair that he followed her as one bewitched. Before them the firs stood erect on the rocky cliff, and by the pale blue radiance of the summer air he could see that the hillside dropped sheer beyond. He walked behind and looked at her, with mind and senses filled with secret memories of their meetings in her bower at night, with pride in being the master of her loveliness. And when they came to the end of the glen, where the lake lay far below under the dark wooded heights, there was a little grassy slope between great shivering aspens. He ran up, embraced her from behind, and turned her face towards his own. Hers was pale, bedewed with warmth. As soon as he took her in his arms, he felt that she grew weak and trembled in her everlasting animal docility. This was before he knew that Steinfinn was to die, and before he had ever suspected that any man could hold their betrothal to be anything but a binding, irrevocable bargain. In all these years he had never dared to recall to mind how it had been to feel nothing but the youth within him and all the world's beauty in a young maid. His longing caught him by the throat and made his eyes burn in their sockets. Olav rose from the ground and let his arms drop. He gazed out at the patch of starry sky, black velvet powdered with gold, that lay above this unknown country in which he had lost himself. Unconsciously he caught a whiff of smoke from a fire somewhere in the night. He divined that now he had well nigh unravelled the whole skein of his life's misfortune to the end of the thread. "Cleanse me from my secret faults, O Lord." He had learnt this in his morning prayers. In all these years, when he recalled that psalm, he must have thought upon his own evil deeds. Now he saw that what he had tried to conceal, both from God and men, was that he might have gone astray from weakness, from childish thoughtlessness and blind desire. That he had sought to deny at any cost, even if he should take upon himself the guilt of far worse deeds, charge himself with a burden of sorrow so heavy that it broke him down. Then rather that. If only it might look as if he had acted with premeditation, and accepted his sorrows knowingly and of his own free will. "And preserve thy servant from the power of strangers. Let them not have dominion over me, so shall I remain unspotted. Let me not submit to my enemies," he had meant. And then it had been nothing but his own sheer nature that kept him from submitting to his enemies. He would not bend to men for whom he had no respect or who opposed him. To such he had always shown his stubborn obstinacy and his mute, cold defiance. It was towards his friends he was weak and submissive, even to falseness and dissembling. It was when he first became aware of his love for his child bride that his whole being was inflamed and bent aside from uprightness, melting and leaning over like a heated candle. That should have been the object of his prayers. Courage, so that he dared acknowledge his blushing. Strength, so that he ventured to act rightly and speak the truth without heeding the judgment of those he loved. But in all these years he had believed himself to be a hard and stubborn, steadfast man. He had himself chosen the bitter lot of Cain, and he had chosen it of necessity, since he was to be the master and protector of the frail, weak-minded wife to whom he had been bound as a child. And yet he had had to do violence to himself many a time before he could act as a hard man, gag the voice of his own conscience. Do we not know how ready a man is to do wrong blindly, when friendship and love are at stake, when joy and pleasure call? He had said to himself he was playing for a higher stake. And he had not been playing. He had merely shuffled the draftsman like a witless child. He had not chosen the lot of Cain. He himself had never known when he made a choice. Olav clenched his teeth. It was as though another had pronounced this judgment upon him, and he would still defend himself, deny it. But the memory of that evening in the garden came back to him. Old as he was, it required no more than a false air of youth, and he let himself be carried away, ran to grasp at the first shadow that played before his eyes. True, he had not thought of sinning. He had thought of nothing. As to the blind lad, at whose side he had heard Mass day after day, he had not remembered his existence. His mouth filled with water, as in his boyhood when he chanced to see anything that was alive with maggots. Weak, hasty, short-sighted, sleek-skinned, and spiritually yet a baby. A man of near 40 winters. Olav laughed despairingly. No, that judgment he would not accept. In a fleeting vision he recalled the dream of his former night in the woods. A bed of leaves in the midst of the darkness. A naked white body lying in it, the slain child, as he had seen in pictures of a deathbed, the soul leaving the dying man's mouth in the likeness of a little child, and angels and devils contending for it. He trembled in extreme terror. Again the feeling came over him that he had had as a child on seeing maggots. And in the wild horror that seized him now that he saw what he had concealed from himself beneath his manifest sins, the temptation awoke, simply to throw more leaves over the murdered child, hide it completely, and fly. And as though the words were spoken without him, he heard, childish, soft, heedless. Such a character he would scarcely be given by the neighbours at home. Weak? Him? The memories roused by the fever of the dance returned, and now they seemed like a troop hastening to his succour. He could not judge his whole conduct as a grown man by the headlong follies he had committed on finding himself, a lad bereft of kinsfolk, charged with a cause which called for great resourcefulness if a full-grown man were to bring it to an honourable issue, nor by the years he had spent at Hestviken, tied to a wife who was able neither to live nor die. He had always been different in those periods of his life when he had been able to act with free hands. Surely he need not call himself white-livered and soft-hearted for disliking his Uncle Barnum's fatuous and useless cruelty, nor weak because it went against the grain to slay teat. It was, as that youth himself had said, far too like hunting flies with a falcon. Had he not been just as brave, just as eager for the sword-play as the boldest among the Earl's men? A trusty comrade, well liked by his fellows, a friend with most, not too good a friend with any, loyal to defend his neighbour, cautious whom he trusted. God! My lot might have been so cast that I could lead a man's life, perform manly deeds like my forefathers, achieve my meed of honourable exploits. Thou didst set me where I had to fight with sickness and misfortunes black as hell, till I felt myself sink to the knees in mire. Does it make me a coward if I know myself that I was often afraid, though no man saw me flinch? Did I run blindly after my own desires, when I renounced pardon, manor, and wife, at the moment when all were within my reach, for the sake of following my banished lord in his outlawry? But at the bare thought of the Earl, his heart began to quiver with the old ardent loyalty. If at any time he had blindly followed his own desires, it was when he rejoined the Earl. At that time he had forgotten Ingunn almost. He knew he was bound to her. Never would he abandon his claim that their relation that autumn had been a lawful one. the consummation of an agreed marriage. But he had not remembered his love for his wife. Of his affection for Earl Alf he had never spoken to a soul. Fate had given him a woman for his only trusty friend, and how should she be able to grasp anything of a squire's affection for his lord? Olav drew himself up in agitation. About him loomed the trees. Black and immensely high, they hid from him the starry heaven. He had a feeling that he was in flight, carrying himself off as booty into the woods. Here the path dropped so steeply that every moment he was in danger of falling headlong. It was dark as a badger's hole under the huge masses of foliage, and the track was full of big stones and twisted roots. Olav guessed that he must have left the broad, beaten path that he had followed at first. This gave him a strange feeling of relief. Now he was forced to have a care of his feet, and he had to think of where he was, and whether perhaps he might reach some habitation where he could obtain lodging for the night. In this country one could not enter the first house one came to along the road and ask for shelter, as at home. Once, when he had to stop to empty his shoes of all the earth he had got in them, he came across the same smell of smoke as he had noticed before when he sat on the ridge. It must be the smoke of a watchfire. It was not likely that folk would keep the hearth fire burning in any house so late at night. So it seemed there were men abroad in the wood. Olav took his sword out of the slit in his kirtle and let it hang in readiness. With his wonted caution, he tried if it were loose in the scabbard, and then walked on, slowly and quietly, holding it in his left hand. The path swung out around a sort of promontory, where the slope of the valley was bare of trees. Right under him, farther down, he saw a fire burning among the brushwood. The discovery filled him with unreflecting joy. No one could tell what sort of men might frequent this place, but Olav rejoiced at the prospect of meeting no matter whom, if only he might escape from solitude. Now he saw the flame through the trees, heard the crackling of the fire. It lighted up a little clearing under the wooded slope on the farther side of the river, casting a red reflection upon the black running water. Between him and the fire he made out the dark forms of two men, and heard voices. The path led down to a little plank bridge, and across to the meadow. The men lying about the fire did not hear his approach, as they had just thrown an armful of dry faggots into the blaze. They were three young fellows, dressed as men of the people, none of the worst sort, seemingly. So he called to them. They started up. Olav held his cloak wrapped about him with his left hand. As he stepped into the light of the fire, it struck him that it would have been just as wise if he had first taken off the 2 gold rings with gleaming stones that he wore on that hand, but now it was too late. He greeted the men and asked, as well as he could, if this were the way to London. As far as he could make out from their answer, it was not. The men pointed in the direction of the stream and over the hill. It was evident that the road to town ran on the high ground toward the southwest, but the men thought he would not be able to find it in the dark, and he had better stay with them till daylight. Olav nodded and thanked them. Then they threw him some armfuls of leafy boughs that they had cut. Olav spread them out and lay down by the fire. It did him good. Now he felt that he was ready to drop with tiredness and hollow with hunger. He had eaten no more than once that day, and that was many hours ago. So he wished these strangers would offer him something, but they did not. It seemed they had eaten their supper. Now they tied up the mouths of their bags again and stretched themselves on their beds of leaves, 2 of them. The third was to sit and watch. So Olav did not care to ask for food. They lay chatting for a while, as well as they could. The men were from the west, nor was their speech like that of the London folk, Olav heard. To their questions he replied that he had been to the pilgrim's church. He had lost his companions. He was a Norseman. But the conversation flagged. Then one of them began to snore, and soon after Olaf also fell asleep. It was still night when he awoke, but the darkness seemed to have thinned. Dawn was not far off. He had slept heavily and dreamlessly, but cold and hunger waked him. The fire had almost gone out, and the watchman seemed to be asleep. Olaf got up noiselessly and went down to the river. At any rate, he would have a drink of water. He knelt down and filled his hand. Then he was on his feet again with a bound. He felt that someone was behind him. No time to draw his sword. He flung himself upon the man and felt the knife slash his cheek. It was lucky he did not get it in his eye. But he had got a good hold of the other and gripped his head under his arm so that the man's cries were half stifled. The knife, thought Olaf, but could not let go. So he raised his knee and drove it into the fellow's ribs, scarcely noticing that he got a stab in the thigh as he tried to wrestle the knife away. But this gave the stranger a chance to close with Olaf, and locked together they rocked and wrestled in the darkness, each trying to throw the other into the river. The man's smell and the firm, hot hug of the flesh-and-blood opponent filled Olaf with a deep sense of voluptuous joy. He put forth all his strength. It was like pressing back the iron-bound gates of a castle against the assaults of the enemy. Now he heard that the others were on their feet. At that moment he got a hold and succeeded in throwing his adversary. His body crashed into the bushes. Olaf drew his sword and ran to meet the other two, with never a thought that he was running into danger and not away. There they were. In the dark he knocked aside a weapon, an axe no doubt, struck and felt that he got home, and well. There was a cry, and something fell in a heap. His second blow found nothing but the empty air, and he ran on. The plank bridge was too far, so he took a run and leapt out into the stream. He splashed a stroke or two, then found bottom. When he stood up, the water came to his middle, but the bottom was muddy, and he sank into it. Then he got hold of something, overhanging branches, and then a root. The turf broke away under his knee, mould and gravel, or whatever it was, rolled down into the water. A moment later he was standing on the other bank. They were howling and roaring on the other side. Olaf threw off his drenched cloak and wound it about his left arm, broke into the thicket, and forced his way through the undergrowth, with his bare sword in his right hand. Only now did he notice that he had cut it, wresting the knife from the first robber. The blood poured from it. Now and again he stopped a moment to listen. They must be on the plank bridge now. It seemed they had no great heart to pursue him. Perhaps they guessed it was too uncertain in the dark and the thick underwood. Accursed wood it was, nothing but thorns and brambles. Olaf made his way up the slope, protecting his face as well as he could with the cloak about his left arm. Arrived on the high ground, he presently came upon a broad road which seemed to lead down the valley. The sky was growing lighter now, and the stars were fewer and paler. The woods swelled darkly against the first signs of dawn. Again he stood and listened. He heard nothing of any men now, no sound but the tiny rustling of some small animal low on the ground among fallen leaves. Here were tall trees, beeches. Olaf walked on more slowly, and now he felt the whole weight of his soaking kirtle beating heavily against him as he walked. He was wet from top to toe, and as soon as he had gone a little way at an even pace, he began to shiver in his clothes, which clung to him, cold as ice. It did him good in a way. Vaguely and with a strange indifference, he remembered the rushing stream of inward experiences that had carried him along from evening till darkest midnight. What had afterwards befallen him, his fight with the robbers and his flight through the thorn thicket, seemed to have placed an enormous distance between him and his hours of revelation. It was clear to him that he had not seen these visions with any faculty that dwelt within himself. A light had poured in upon him from without, and it was clear to him that he had called troops to his succour against this power, and help from that quarter where a man never seeks it in vain, when he would defend himself against the truth. That help had surely been given to him. He knew, too, that if at that moment he had had the power to see clearly and understand fully what it was that he had done, understand not only with the head but also with the heart, then he must have been a desperate man. But he felt nothing but relief, and the cold from his clinging wet clothes wrapped itself around him and made him calm, as one puts out a fire with wet sails. He wiped his face and found that it was scratched by the thorns and bleeding, and blood was running down the inner side of his right thigh. After a while he was going lame, but kept on walking. It was as though he could not check his pace. So he walked and walked, stupid at times with sleep. A mist rose from all low-lying lands on the approach of morning. All at once the fog surrounded him, dense and white, hiding the blue of heaven and putting out the last of the stars. Olav had been walking half asleep for some time, and stumbling now and again in the deep ruts that scored the turf of the road. Now he was wide awake for a moment. Within the moist and muffling fog, the trees loomed huge beyond their natural size. Through Olav's tired brain there flashed a last glimpse of that world of visions to which he had been admitted, and from which he had fled. In an instant it was gone again. The grass was soaked with dew, bent down and grey all over. The road led through a forest of great ancient oaks, and in the thick undergrowth every bush was wreathed in cobwebs, which were coated with dewdrops. Olav shivered as he stood, and when he moved on again he felt his right leg heavy and painful, and his hose stiff with blood. After a while he came into a field, where red dappled cattle were grazing in the fog. Olav called to the old man who was herding them, but received no answer that he could understand. Again a while, and he was in a village street, and now he could ask his way, so that he reached London just as the sun was breaking through and all the bells of the city were ringing. He entered by one of the gates on the east side. He had gone a great way round out in the country. Olav looked neither to the right nor to the left. Half asleep he limped through the town, ragged, bespattered, and torn about the face. Down at the Hythe he found a waterman to take him off to his ship. The others had come home the evening before. They seemed to be glad when Olav came aboard. He told them he had been surrounded by some men who tried to rob him in the forest, but had cut his way out in the darkness, and after that he had lost himself. Not much more was said about it, but when Galfrid was helping him and washing away the clotted blood, and Leif came with a bucket of water, the lad could not contain himself. "So it was you, Olav, and not I, that came home at last with a hole in his skin," he said with a sly smile. Yes, one never knows." Olav shrugged his shoulders. Galfrid bound up his hand and bandaged his thigh. The other scratches were nothing. Olav stayed on board for the most part during the week they yet lay by the Thames side. Then they sailed home.